Professor Richard Coyne, who's going to speak this evening, and whose book, Designing Information Technology in the Postmodern Age, From Method to Metaphor, is published at the moment by MIT Press. He's going to be looking at some of the discourses on computers and the way in which they link up with philosophical ideas. He's recently taken up the new chair of architectural computing in the Department of Architecture at the University of Edinburgh, and he researches and teaches in the area of multimedia and computer-mediated communication, especially as those are applied to architectural education and to architectural practice. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Professor Coyne.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody for this opportunity to be here. I'm going to be talking about information technology, which I'll abbreviate to IT. And I'll be talking about IT culture and trying to come to terms with what is distinctive about IT culture. Now, I guess it's unarguably the case, no one would disagree, it's the case that information technology, IT, is significant and is consequential. But what I want to present today is the notion that what's said about IT in many of the media that I'll look at is in fact fairly conventional. We haven't yet come to terms with what is exciting and radical and different about information technology. Now, in trying to come to terms with IT, let's look at the phenomenon of IT culture, IT talk. Here's one of the things that characterizes it. It tends to be, more than anything, I think, looking to something else. In fact, looking to the future. Now, I don't have any devices here. Joel, could you perhaps move to the next slide? How is this manifested? Well, reading Time magazine recently, we have a lot of journalistic exposition about the nature of information technology, and one reads that in 10 years' time we'll be taking virtual vacations using this kind of configuration of hardware. Now, that's an example of a projection into the future, and quite a ridiculous one. Next slide, please. Another example, Howard Rheingold is one of the foremost proponents of IT and has written a book called The Virtual Community, and before that a book called Virtual Reality. And in that he describes different laboratories where they're experimenting with virtual reality technology, but very quickly he moves on from a description of the prosaic researches that are going on at the moment and projects very rapidly into the future. So it's not what's happening now in these research labs, but what will happen shortly, when we'll all be plugged into data suits and we'll have this computer-mediated sensory experience. Next slide. Perhaps we'll work out some signal. I'll sort of wave my right arm, Joel. Another quote, or a quote this time, from our friend William Mitchell, who's an architect and a commentator on information technology and its implications. With higher bandwidths, ever greater processing power and more sophisticated input-output devices designed to take advantage of these capabilities, the boundary that has traditionally been drawn by the edge of the computer screen will be eroded. Through head-mounted stereo displays or through holographic television, it's coming, you'll be able to immerse yourself in simulated environments instead of just looking at them through a small rectangular window. Now, my reason for highlighting this and other quotes is not simply to question whether or not they will come to pass, but just the very fact that we find it, well, acceptable and desirable to anticipate and to project into the future when talking about IT. Now, what's the nature of this future? Well, it impinges on society generally. People talk about a better, egalitarian, more free future that will be opened up by information technology. The shapes of our cities will change. In William Mitchell's recent book, City of Bits, he talks about the various institutions that are throughout the city, such as museums, libraries, schools, and so on, and the informational basis of each of those institutions, and how, as information infrastructures change, those institutions will change, and therefore the shapes of our cities will change. Also, I used to be heavily involved in artificial intelligence research, and there is a great deal of talk about the future. We mustn't look at the simple programs that are being developed at the moment robot block stacking programs, but look to the future in 10 years' time when there'll be more sophisticated computer systems that exhibit intelligence. Now this future talk, if you like, is a common feature of any technology. It seems to accompany any technology, and here I'm indebted to James Carey, who's a media theorist, for bringing this to our attention. Similar things were said of the steam train. Obviously, steam power was a uniting force spatially within Europe and within America, but even more than that, people claimed that because steam was white and pure and powerful, that it was in fact in its own right going to usher in a new world. Similar things were said of electricity. Not only was electricity uniting the world by affecting certain kinds of communication, but also electricity united positive and negative forces and was therefore to be some sort of uniting technology. So this is a common feature of any technology. This kind of future talk imbues any technology. I guess one of the distinctive features, though, of information technology is that the very technology itself is also used as the medium for the dissemination of these ideas. So one of the fascinating things about IT is the concept of the internet and the fact that that medium itself is the vehicle for talking about the medium. So we don't frequently use the telephone to talk about the telephone, but people use the internet to talk more than anything else about the internet. So it's a very reflective sort of medium. Also, it's a medium that's come from, I guess, the American academic system, research system and academic system. And the academic system, particularly of America, is imbued with Enlightenment concepts of freedom through education, of liberation, and so on. And that very much imbues IT culture, those notions. So one of my main points is that IT culture and the internet is imbued through and through with notions from the Enlightenment via our academic institutions. What I'm going to look at in detail, I guess, is these factors of IT future talk. It's utopian. It embodies notions from the arts and crafts movement of the 19th century. It's romantic. It involves revolutionary thinking of sorts. It's medieval in some ways. And of course, it involves systems theory. Let's look at utopianism. Utopia is a word, if you do a web search or a trawl through the network, utopia occurs many, many times. The real utopia is really a 19th century phenomenon. The notion of utopia, of course, was popularised with Thomas More's book by that name. But it's generally regarded that the archetypal utopias were books such as Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, in which he projected a future that was heavily industrialised, heavily hierarchised, very mechanised, but a very reasonable future. So the distinctive feature of a utopia is that the future that's decided or projected is a very reasonable future. It's one in which reason holds sway over unreason. Now, counter to Bellamy's utopia, William Morris projected a utopia into the 20th century, and that was in his book View from Nowhere, in which he projected a sort of a socialist future, but no less reasonable future than Bellamy's, and we'll come back to those subsequently. Here's just some slides. All these images are taken from the World Wide Web, just browsing, searching for things, and then screen dumping the images. Next slide. There's a lot of uncompleted work on the web, and of course utopia comes into that category. Very difficult to find references to William Morris, I discovered, but here's one to his wife. This is just to remind us that, in fact, this whole utopian notion is embedded, of course, in the American Constitution, which is the Enlightenment document par excellence. Another feature of this future that's projected is that it's a future that will free us from bodily concerns. So it's often suggested that the internet, the World Wide Web and so on and IT will free people up. We'll get down to the essential person. People will be able to communicate on the level of minds rather than worrying about the interventions of bodies. So again, that's a notion of reason taking over. Okay, that's the utopian thread to IT talk. Let's look at the arts and crafts movement. Of course, William Morris was one of the foremost proponents of arts and crafts. He was involved in a movement that was reacting against heavy industrialisation, of course, and the destruction of the countryside and so on, and advocated a return to simple crafts and simple arts. And that movement continues through to the present day in various forms. We can trace through to notions of art, the Bohemian lifestyle, the hippie movement, and the sense of a return to nature and to the countryside and to craft. That seems to imbue IT culture in various ways. One proponent of this was Marshall McLuhan, writing in the 60s, who didn't so much talk about arts and crafts, but said that we were returning through electronic communications to a tribal culture. So returning back to an age where people were in touch with nature, where they were in touch with one another. And this is one of McLuhan's great legacies, I suppose. It's this positive utopian view of information technology as taking us back to something that we'd lost. And he, of course, suggested that we wear all mankind under our skin in the electronic age. The other movement, which is perhaps represented by the next slide, is Alvin Toffler's proposal of the electronic cottage. So this is where the electronic age ushers in a whole new kind of productivity, where we're working with natural materials and where industries and so on are localised. And so some people within the whole IT field have more or less picked up on this. And the Whole Earth Catalogue, developed by Howard Rheingold, is an attempt to return to that kind of involvement. And it's often said that IT and the internet and so on is in fact a way of realising the cottage industry idea. Software development is something that can be developed at a very local level. It can be distributed from a local site through the internet. So even though the hardware that we're dealing with is the product of a very industrialised process, the development of software itself is a sort of a craft activity. Okay, another theme that comes through is that of Romanticism. Now, I'd argue very strongly, and I'll take this up with anybody afterwards if they want to pursue it, it's controversial, I suppose, is that the dominant philosophy, if you like, or the dominant theme in IT culture is not rationalism. It's not a hard-nosed view that everything can be reduced. It's not reductionism. It's not the mathematisation of the world. It's rather the counter view to that, which is, as I say, Romanticism. And Romanticism, what are its seeds? Well, after Descartes and others who tried to rationalise, who tried to reduce everything to number and logic, it seems, we had more or less a counter-movement. If Descartes and the rationalists represented the culture of the object, the people that followed represented the culture of the subjective, the culture of the subject. And they elevated the notions of subject. And what does that mean? Well, there are sort of three pillars to Romanticism. One is the notion of feeling and emotion. The second is the importance of the imagination as a human faculty, almost contrasted to reason sometimes. And then finally is the notion of the hero and the genius. So the creative spirit is within all of us and needs to be unleashed so we can exercise our creative skills. This is Romanticism. And that imbues IT culture in various ways. It imbues architecture, that's certainly the case, and it imbues art. These slides are just reminders of that. The feature one could, or the point one could make about Disneyland is not just that it's a land of the imagination and therefore somehow tied to the romantic, but next slide, it and so much of American West Coast popular culture, at least as we're reminded by Umberto Eco, is to do with the elevation of the individual, giving the genius free scope to exercise his or her skills. So much of this culture is about the heroic individual. And I'm reminded of this particularly today, not relating to this slide yet. My friend John Lansdowne and I went down to see the Art and Power exhibition down the South Bank, which is an excellent exhibition of art in the fascist years between the wars in Europe. And it's interesting, we often do tend to think of this pure romanticism, this heroism and valour paraded in artistic form and so on. And we tend to associate so much of what was happening in Europe then as romantic, but we tend to ignore the fact that Romanticism imbues so much of American culture, and dare I say it, so much of British culture. It is really the dominant culture of the age. And certainly it feeds through into IT culture. And so even, here looking at one of the heroes and anti-heroes of IT culture. IT culture loves to elevate certain individuals, to parade them, and then also to knock them down, which is part of the romantic legacy. Bill Gates' fair game, we've more or less been given license to use and to illustrate whatever point we like. One of the popular journals that I think would bring this out would be Wired magazine, and this is the internet version. Okay, another theme that's coming through in IT culture is that of revolutionary thinking, and revolutionary thinking is tied very strongly to Romanticism. The tie is made well and truly by Rousseau, who wrote in the 18th century and reminded us that in the development of the child to manhood, it was a matter of allowing the child free scope to his creativity. So whereas the empiricists said that the education process begins with a blank slate, and onto that we write life's experiences, Rousseau and the Romantics said, well, no, as the child develops, it's a process of peeling back, of removing prejudices so that the real child can come through. Then later on, he developed that notion, I suppose, and in his book, The Social Contract, where he talked about the heroic leader, who would be the person who would lead people into a new state, who would unleash them from constraints. Then subsequently, of course, people like William Morris took up these themes, and his utopia is a socialist utopia. And I guess that whole legacy, the romantic and revolutionary legacy, of course, comes through William Morris and the socialists, and of course Karl Marx, and then through the Frankfurt School and the critical theorists into the university system. And so certainly in America in the 1960s, when the corporate giants of the current computer age were university students, they were very strongly influenced by the Frankfurt School and Marcuse and others. And this legacy continues through to today. So one of the most prominent features of the internet, for example, and the World Wide Web, is the parading of supposed radicalism and a revolutionary fervour, a desire to change things. And here's some examples. There's rather a large number of these. Obviously, political groups are very interested in the internet. One of the difficulties one has in browsing the web and uncovering these sorts of pages, you never quite know how official they are, whether they in fact represent the organisations they claim to represent. Next one, thanks, John. These were taken from the web a couple of months ago. Of course, the internet has its own cause, the freedom of information, which we'll get to shortly. Here's some messages about the whole issue of encryption, which is a hot issue within IT culture. The notion that you're able to transmit messages to somebody else with complete security, but then the counter notion that really the CIA or somebody else should be able to monitor those messages. Digital jihad. This is quite interesting, this one. There's a whole website dedicated to people posting horror stories of police brutality in America, and you just provide photographs and text to state your case. Of course, none of this is checked, I assume. Anarchy is a word that features very commonly in the World Wide Web. And here's an example. As you know, in the USA there is a law in the making that would restrict and police the internet traffic in an attempt to stop indecent material from spreading. And there's a petition which you can sign. So it's a wonderfully self-contained system, the internet, because it has its own enemies within and people who are actually threatening the system. And then it becomes a focus of fervour. And it's also of great interest to minority groups and self-help groups and lobby groups, pro and anti-abortion groups. Okay, another theme that comes from sort of what I've loosely called revolutionary thinking. I guess you could say it's socialism of a sort. The other theme is medievalism. And this is, I guess, an intriguing notion. Again, Umberto Eco has brought this to our attention, the ubiquity of medieval, or the interest and fascination in medieval ideas in Western culture at the moment. And I guess it's been with us for some time. This is, again, part of the Romantic legacy. Whereas the rationalists invented, in a way, and elevated the classical, the Romantics more or less rebelled against that and elevated the medieval. So whereas for the rationalists, the medieval, the Gothic, were ugly and to be despised and so on, and represented disorder and feudal systems and lack of freedom, later on the Romantics took that up. William Morris, of course, was very much enamoured with the medieval. And I guess one would have to say that this appropriation of the medieval was in fact a reinterpretation. It's not that the real medieval was there, it's an Enlightenment interpretation of the medieval. I guess the transition is fairly easy to see in that Thomas Mallory's Legends of King Arthur, for example, written sort of towards the end of the medieval period, talk of valour, of courtly love, and so on, these various medieval virtues, if you like. It didn't require much to translate those ideas into the notion of the romantic hero. And I guess that's one way that the Romantics have appropriated notions of medieval stories and legends, is by turning the chivalrous knight into the man of reason. Next slide. And we see much evidence of medievalism, if you like, mock medievalism, romantic medievalism, on the internet, obviously overtly in this case. In fact, you can look for it and find it almost anywhere. The medieval represents the other, whereas the Enlightenment fabricated and constructed notions of reason and order. The unreasoned and the disordered is also ever present, and the medieval somehow fits the bill for that. We're dealing with labyrinthine progressions through things. We're dealing with mystery. We're dealing with magic in some cases. And certainly on the internet, we find that. Probably it comes through most clearly with the notion of the carnivalesque. Commentators tell us that prior to the Enlightenment, that the carnival was somehow integrated into everyday life, and the church and the carnival somehow coexisted. But through the Enlightenment, the carnival was more or less marginalised and became something other. And it was a place where people let down their hair, obviously, and also abandoned reason. Now, I guess we see that to some extent in contemporary culture, and certainly we see it in evidence on the internet. So there are attempts to appropriate the weird, the bizarre, And groups who see themselves somehow as marginal like to also appropriate these vehicles and tools of unreason. And rave parties, it could be argued, are a manifestation of the carnivalesque. Also, another medieval theme that comes through is the apocalyptic visions of medieval soothsayers or doomsayers. This is a point that Umberto Eco brings out, the whole notion that we're heading towards the end of a millennium and disaster, and certain groups pick up on that. And of course, overtly, romantic medievalism pervades the internet in the form of certain kinds of games. There are no spelling checkers on the internet. There are too many of these, it's just too easy to find them. Okay, I don't want to say too much about systems theory because I guess my thesis here is that we often think of the computing world as a rationalistic world, perhaps, a reductive world, a mathematical world. And what I've tried to present is that it's very much a romantic world. I brought out these features. But I guess I'll just say one or two things about systems theory. Systems theory, I suppose, it's the notion that you have that any system can be understood in terms of inputs and outputs and feedback loops and so on, and it can be understood diagrammatically. But what seems to be occurring, I guess, is that systems theory is more or less on the decline, but nonetheless is appropriated through internet culture. Often there are whole art forms devoted to the notion of new kinds of systems, where systems are very complex, they're changing, they're dynamic, and the whole internet itself seems to be one of those kinds of labyrinthine systems. So there's kind of an appropriation, a romanticisation of notions of system that imbues the internet. Okay, well, what can we say about these various manifestations of internet culture? Well, I guess my main point is just how incredibly out of touch, if what I've said is true, how out of touch this is with contemporary discourse in philosophy. And one of the things I try to bring out in my book, of course, is the nature of contemporary philosophy and the way that IT culture relates or doesn't relate to that. So I guess we could say the whole notion of reason on which the idea of the future utopia is predicated has been almost blasted out of the water. Reason is not a good model to hold up, to be something that we aspire to. Reason is something that is situational. It doesn't belong to some metaphysic that we can appeal all argument to. So if reason is under question, or if reason is seen as situational and contextual, then what does that say about this future that is a future of reason? It doesn't take much argument to recognise that the arts and crafts movement was regarded in many ways as something of a failure. William Morris was, of course, very disconcerted that really his designs and ideas were really only meaningful in a heavily industrialised society, and in fact it was the bourgeois middle class that appropriated the arts and crafts, never the working class. And one could argue that even though contemporary software development has something of the craft about it, really it's just the beginning of some larger industrial endeavour. So at the moment, even though software can be made by individuals and given away for free, eventually that leads through a fairly complex process to a commercial enterprise that's heavily industrialised. So it can be argued that software often begins free or very cheap and ends up very expensive. Now, how does that fit within the arts and crafts notion? I don't think it does very, very well. Romanticism is just not up to understanding what's going on in the contemporary world. It's very easy, once we've dispensed with notions of rationalism and system and order and so on, to just simply swing the pendulum the other way and to turn our understanding of the world into a romantic one. And many contemporary commentators say that, well, Romanticism, neither objectivism nor subjectivism, are up to understanding the world as it is. Also revolutionary thinking, obviously socialism and capitalism also are under question at the moment. And writers such as Anthony Giddens argue strongly that really that whole dichotomy of left versus right, don't really come to terms with what's been going on politically this century. And these writers are trying to form new ways of understanding society and political systems. Romantic medievalism, I don't have much to say against that. It seems relatively harmless, as long as you recognise that there is in fact no return to some ideal medieval past, that all the time we're recreating it, reconstructing it. Searching around on the web for any hint of insight into contemporary thinking of the kind put forward by Friedrich Nietzsche or Heidegger or Hans-Georg Gadamer or Lyotard or Derrida, a host of contemporary thinkers, is very difficult to find, I must say. There's just one slim reference to Nietzsche. In the book, I look at the nexus between contemporary thought and information technology and tease it out in all sorts of ways, appealing a great deal to Martin Heidegger and his concepts of technology. But what I want to do here is just look at this whole notion of future talk and just see if we can glean any beginnings of insights into perhaps a partially radical view of information technology. What I've constructed is more or less a utopian picture that IT culture is driven by this quest for something in the future. One way of looking at that is to see it as a trading in mythologies. The old mythic pattern. There was a past where things were terrific. There is a present in which things are not as we'd like them to be. And so we return to the past. But in the process, the past undergoes some sort of transformation. So it's a kind of a mythic structure. And one could argue that fits in with Hegel's notions of dialectic and so on. That's one path one could follow. But what I'm interested here in just teasing us the idea of is some of Heidegger's notions about time. That maybe what's going on with IT is not best understood in terms of past, present and future, but in terms of Heidegger's concepts of temporality, which somehow precede notions of time. What Heidegger talks about, I guess, translating it very roughly, is that the most important moment is in fact the situation. All of us are situated. Now, whether that situation exists in time is another matter. That's a derivative phenomenon. To situate things in time is something that comes later. As we're in a moment, as we're situated rather, we enter a situation with baggage, with a background. We come to any situation with something, with preconceptions. When we're in that situation, we're disposed towards it in particular ways. We care about the situation, we care about what's going on. So that's often translated as a projection, which implies a future, but it needn't. And Heidegger doesn't foreclose on the notion of whether it is situated in time. It's just simply a predisposition or a disposition. And he uses the word care to indicate that. So in any situation, we come with baggage, we're there with a background. We're disposed towards that situation, we care about it. And during that situation, occasionally, there are what Heidegger calls breakdowns, which needn't be seen pejoratively. It's just a moment when something occurs that brings to light certain objects and things in our situation. And so we deal with that on the basis of a background and through our caring. Now, as you can see from this quote, if you've read it so far, inasmuch as design, that is the self, understand itself in a way which approximately and for the most part is unauthentic, when we may suppose that time, as ordinarily understood, it does indeed represent a genuine phenomenon, but one which is derivative. And through many pages of his book, Being in Time, he brings out this non-time notion of being situated. Now, as in any philosophical endeavour, if we had several hours or whatever, and we could all read the source material and explore this notion, what I'm very interested in the book and in all my researches is to see what the implications are of these sorts of notions. Next slide, please. So I would argue strongly that Heidegger's view about time, which is in a way a pragmatic view of being, pragmatics of anticipation perhaps, it does have consequences. And those consequences Can we go back now? I'll just... do you know how to go back? It's clicking on the other side. That's a bit more to the left. We're set up for just such an emergency. Yeah, about there. That's it. This sort of pragmatic view, this notion that being is a matter of being involved always, does have consequences, and I'm very interested in seeing what the implications of that are. And the implications are not necessarily stunning. The implications often just result in a re-privileging. So often people say when I cite Heidegger, well, you could have got that from someone else. You could have got that from Bertrand Russell or John Dewey or somebody. But I think probably the power of Heidegger's writing lies in the authority that he has, certainly in the continental tradition, and certainly the force of his writing and the sources that he uses. And through that, if you take it on board, it does produce a different set of priorities. We look at things rather differently and elevate certain things and diminish other things in importance. So, for example, these 6 or so points are not particularly stunning, but I think they more or less follow from what Heidegger's saying, and if we take it on board, these would take priority over notions of what the future holds for computing, for IT, and so on. So, one of the things that this pragmatics of anticipation, I think, brings to light is the notion that IT future talk is in fact a discursive practice, and we can analyse it as such and treat it as such. When somebody gets up and projects into the future and talks glowingly or pejoratively about an IT future, we can see that as a discourse which can be critiqued. Another point, which is obvious really, is that all anticipations are qualitative. So when an IT commentator gets up and says that soon we'll be taking virtual reality holidays using headset data gloves or whatever, there is a qualitative dimension to that comment. It's not just an impartial statement, but one that is imbued with concerns for the moment, so satisfactions or dissatisfactions with some current state. Conceptions of time are situated. So the linear notion of time, or the notion of time as sequence, past, present and future, is in fact situated historically. It in fact trades beautifully in Enlightenment concepts of progress. Once we've created and constructed this notion of progression through time, it naturally follows that information technology, insofar as it's implicated in that, is about faster, better, more ubiquitous, and so on. The authority of certain views of time, when somebody gets up and projects into the future and starts talking about IT, they're in a way asserting their own authority. Certainly people who are involved in the IT business have the most to gain by prognosticating about the future. And that's something that I think Heidegger's view of time allows us to explore. And then I think we can go on. I won't cover all these except to mention the notion of causality, and this is one of Heidegger's big themes, that we needn't regard information technology as causing various changes, but somehow it's implicated in those changes. And Heidegger opens up to question the whole notion of what causes what. Next slide, and the one after that. So I'll just conclude on this, and we'll open this to questions or discussion. I don't think there's anything wrong with IT future talk, and there's nothing wrong with utopianism. I just think we need to stand back very often and reflect on it. And I think in that reflection we can in fact discover something about, well, certainly contemporary thinking, but also about information technology. So, thank you. A level playing field, yes.
Yeah, and technology is still relatively expensive. Sure, you can buy cheap stuff for not very much money, but to get real stuff, you have to buy fast modem, bigger computers, lots more memory. They're constantly updating it, so your machine gets out of date very quickly. It's all in English.
It's in English.
The internet. It's very Western. And so how is this going to revolutionize cities and when we communicate with the rest of the world? When so much of our markets
Yes, that's a very good point, yes. It won't, will it? I mean, you're just supporting my view, I hope, because I hope I didn't give the impression that I thought that this technology was revolutionary and was going to bring about the freedoms that were promised. Yes, it's very culturally bound, and it's everything that you say it is. And so I'm sure there will be changes, and the internet and IT will be implicated in those changes, but I don't think it's just simply a medium for making us freer. I just don't see that as a very meaningful concept.
Can I ask a question? I mean, when you gave the sort of elements of, like, the ideology of the internet, utopianism, the Romanticism, I suppose one way of characterizing those elements is that they're all a fantasy about something which lacks nothing. I mean, starting with utopian thought, it seems to me it's always based on a thought of some kind of totality which kind of lacks nothing. And that actually seems to be, you know, part of the very sort of concept, as it were, of like information or whatever. I mean, it's not just that these are sort of contingent ideologies. You know, we opened up IT and we happened to find that they like kind of King Arthur or something. But it's almost kind of endemic to somehow what you might call like the wish to be on the internet, the wish to be somewhere where you are not lacking in something, as if the practical experience of anything from kind of urban to personal life is that you do lack something. And so this is an enormous kind of technical buttress to the fantasy that you could be lacking nothing. The second part is that I also think that's a very dangerous fantasy. I mean, although in a sense the examples you give have a certain harmless adolescence about them, I mean, if those ideologies are carried into practical life, that insofar as you lack something, there could be a space in which you don't.
Yes, the slightly seedy side of it, I suppose, is the notion of the technological fix, which isn't quite what you're referring to, I guess. It's another form of the technological fix, that society is going to be patched up somehow with all its foibles through this sort of technology.
I mean, clearly that will have a sort of radical paranoia, if only they would leave it alone. You know, whatever it is, kind of people who are destroying the environment and CIA. But I mean, it seems to me almost like an incredible understatement when you said this is hardly adjusted to the concerns of contemporary philosophy. I'm sure you're right.
Yes, it's also hardly adjusted to the concern of contemporary society, yes.
That's right. But which does, in a sense, have written into it a kind of tragic dimension. I suppose the question is information technology capable of kind of bringing to birth its own conception of tragedy?
Well, it's a good question. I guess my view of the first stage of this process is just simply to recognise that that IT culture, as I've demonstrated, and I hope I haven't misrepresented it, I don't think I have, is sort of naive, is Enlightenment, is simplistic. It just hasn't moved on. It's not up to the current age. So I think the first step is simply to recognise that, maybe to argue against what I've said. I've never heard anybody argue against it. But then move on to other views. And I think that's where Heidegger comes in very well, because he talks so much about how we're inframed by our technologies, and that happened 2 millennia ago, according to him. And information technology is just the latest manifestation of that. So in fact, the danger or the peril already occurred back with the Greeks, according to Heidegger. And that's a whole other chapter session. Yep.
Everything seems to be in that perception. You are not suggesting hope that someone else looking at the internet couldn't make a similar troll and justify entirely rational scientific view of the world in order to create a counter argument to yours using very similar but different examples.
Yeah, that wouldn't worry me at all. One could trawl the internet, perhaps. I don't think you could. But anyway, you could certainly trawl IT culture generally, as we know from work in artificial intelligence and so on, and come up with a much, well, the counter view, the rationalistic view, if you like. What I've paraded here is the romantic. But as many contemporary philosophers and commentators say, the two are not that far apart. The romantic and the rationalistic go hand in hand. The two cultures coexist now as they did 200 years ago. So I'm often wary when somebody does say, well, isn't it terrible, all this reductionism in computing and what have you? You sort of feel, well, you have a kindred spirit, somebody who maybe agrees with you, but then it turns out that really what they're adopting as counter to that is simply the subjectivist romantic view. And the pendulum just keeps swinging from one to the other. And I think we miss the point of what's going on in contemporary philosophy, certainly, if we don't recognise that people like Heidegger and his followers, if you like, are desperately trying to stop the pendulum from swinging, and I guess mixing metaphor, whatever, moving it somewhere else, so that there are new concerns, not just those two concerns. Yep. Replace the book. That sounds like a trap question, because I've just talked about the future and future talk, and how every time people talk about IT, they feel bound to project into the future. I guess the same could be said about audiences. People feel bound to ask questions about the future, and what your view of it is. I don't know that I should answer that, because the whole point of the talk really is just the notion of time, and how we feel bound to do just what you're saying, to ask about the future. Concealing the fact that, in a way, in that question are some concerns. Now, maybe I should just ask you, well, are you concerned about the book? Does that represent a hope or a problem or a fear for you? My answer is I don't know, and I don't feel bound to answer it.
But when those questions arise about, they arise very vividly in Victor Hugo, where someone argues, Archie can follow, that the Gutenberg press will kill architecture. And I was thinking when you were introducing the lecture with like 19th century discussions about the future consequences of technical kind of change. There are whole pages in the cultural historian A.B. Warburg where he argues that the telephone will completely destroy humanity. Now, it's not just some sort of Nostradamus kind of prediction. It's really, those discussions about the future are about how human attributes are kind of organized, how malleable they are, and what happens if something came along that would really shift a fundamental kind of attribute. So Warburg's argument is that it takes literally kind of millions of years to establish a psychic space between human beings, which is what he calls the zone of thought, of science, of whatever. Destroy that through the telephone, and you destroy humanity.
in a way, I guess we're always looking for the heroic response. That is, yes, the book is dead. You know, one could come up with, parade all sorts of wonderful statements that seize people's imagination, and that's part of IT future talk. It's part of the game, it seems, and so lots of people in IT culture do that. And really, one suspects that the situations we're going to find ourselves in will be ones where things find a balance. It'll be an incredibly complex interweaving of technologies with human practices. Our practices will adapt and adjust. Technologies will change. We're inventing technologies to adapt to our practices. All this suggests some sort of levelling and play between practice and technology, which doesn't sound very heroic, because it's not a spectacular consequence. You know, it doesn't produce slogans, that sort of thing. And IT future talk and so much of the internet and that whole culture seems to want the heroic response. It wants the definitive, bold, spectacular answer.
But not only
It applies.
people want the definitive answer. They go to everything.
But especially in IT. Well, I guess they share similar legacies, and there's no question of that. And the idea of a complex working out just doesn't fit that desire.
Can I ask a sort of more general question? It's covering your artificial intelligence work you've done. Are you taking that any further from that, or are you doing any more research into that area, or has that sort of come to a close?
No, I'm not actively researching in the area, but that could well change. It would depend on students' interests and so on. But I'm certainly active in critiquing it, and in the book that has been mentioned, there's a fairly substantial critique of it. Well, there are aspects of artificial intelligence which are very interesting to phenomenologists and contemporary thinkers, Hubert Dreyfus and others. And one could talk about neural networks, for example, and as a sort of a metaphor regime for talking about human cognition, which of course is tied to reduction and to mathematics and so on, but nonetheless is very interesting in the light of phenomenology.
Okay, well, perhaps we should end there. I should just say that there are some remaining copies in the Triangle Bookshop of the person coming to book. We thank you very much for an extremely interesting evening. Thank you.
It's a very subdued audience. Subdued audience. It's a good speaker, perhaps.